came up here as a student, I don't want to say how long ago, it was about 27 years ago. Then about 3 or 4 years later, well, I should say before that, we in our panel last night, we talked about the Capital Fellows Program. You guys are probably familiar with the Capital Fellows Program. I applied for that program and got an interview with the Senate Fellow Program and did horribly in an interview, so I was not a Capital Fellow. But a few years later, I came up and worked for the Legislative Analyst's Office for a few years in the early 2000s. I was just telling Tino that I started about 9 days before the 9/11 attacks, and that whole security thing that we all went through was not there when I started. But I was then a panelist up here when I was with the LAO. I was invited to be a panelist, and so kind of come full circle now as a moderator. So with that, I'll introduce our panel, very distinguished panel. I'm very excited to have you all here. So we can talk about elections. So to my far right, I have Steve Maviglio, who's a principal at Forza Communications. To his left is Dwayne DeChara. Did I get close?
Yeah.
DeChara, okay. DeCara, thank you. And then to his left is Laura Forty, who is co-author of the California Playbook at Politico. And then to my immediate right is Tino Rossi, the Vice President at Swing Strategies. So we'll kick it off. So we have a lot of students who are aspiring to come work in the Capitol. So some of our other panels, we heard from younger staff people last night. We just had a panel of lobbyists. So the first thing I'll ask you is just to talk about how did you come to work up in the Capitol? What was your pathway here? Where did you study in college and so on? What were kind of your breaks along the way that allowed you to come up and work in Sacramento? So Steve, we'll start with you, but Emma later.
Sure. I started working on a campaign for a local school board person in my hometown, which I really suggest is apparently networking. You know how it is?
Yep.
I would really suggest you work on a campaign locally because you get hands-on everything in a campaign. Now, it'd be great to work for Joe Biden or Donald Trump, but if you work on a local campaign, you get the whole breadth of experience. You kind of figure out where you want to go. Communications, strategy, all kinds of things are involved. Anyway, started with that. I worked for a congressman in Washington, D.C. for a while, congressman from Sacramento, and then for another congressman from New Jersey, who was a nuclear physicist. Tried working for a nuclear physicist. They know everything about anything. And then was hired as the press secretary for Governor Gray Davis, who you may not remember because you probably weren't born, but he was the guy that got recalled by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then I worked for 3 different speakers of the assembly here before starting my own firm and running campaigns and legislative issues. So it was sort of get more experience as you go along, find out what you want to do, and then get a job you really like. So that's what I did.
I actually sort of stumbled into it. I went to UC Davis. And grew up in Yolo County in a rural area. Went to law school at USD and found out that I was growing broke quickly. Didn't understand how much it cost to live in a city. I lived with a former Wilson campaign manager at the time, one of his campaign people. He moved out, and in the old days, you ever know cell phones, rotary phones, so I kept his phone. So the party boss called, they used to also have party bosses, and said, "You've got a job over in the 78th Assembly District as the manager." So I showed up, I took the job, and by the time they figured out that it was me and not him, I stayed. And so possession matters. And then I stayed in politics. Did a little bit of law, land use, but decided that I liked the competition of politics better than the dusty law books, which I hated touching. There weren't computers, no LexisNexis then either, so it was all those wretched books. And then worked my way up, running campaigns in San Diego, Orange County, and then California, mostly congressional and target legislative. I tend to work in the seats that are target targets, meaning real close between the two. That's kind of what I do.
My path is a little bit different as a journalist. I'm not actually from California, I'm from Kansas, and I always knew I wanted to work in politics in some capacity because I was just so interested in it. And then I got to college and I went to go interview for the student newspaper, and I said, I'm also going to go do student senate. And they said, well, you can't do both, it's a conflict of interest. And I was already at the newspaper, so I said, okay, I'll do the newspaper. But I really love political journalism. I think it's a great way to, if you're interested in politics, you kind of get all the fun of like the horse race without any of the responsibility if you screw up a campaign. Yeah, so after college, I worked in Austin, Texas for a little bit. Austin, Texas, Texas politics is like a whole nother beast if you're interested in it. And then came out here, worked for the Sacramento Bee, covering the state capitol for a while. If you want to be a political journalist, I say this all the time, that like Washington, D.C. is very saturated. State houses are where it's at, especially as we see like Roe v. Wade overturned. A lot of the fights are happening in individual legislatures. And so I would really encourage anybody who's interested in it to do that. After the Sacramento Bee, I got hired at Politico. I live here in Sacramento and work with our offices, all around the country, in DC and New York. We have bureaus down in Los Angeles. And I cover a lot of things, everything from like the Senate race that's happening right now to like hearings that happen in rooms like this in the Capitol. But yeah, I've really enjoyed it so far, and I get to talk to very smart guys like these who get to be quoted in my stories.
Thanks, and off the record here on how I got into politics.
It's not off the record.
Yeah, exactly. Like most things in my life, I sort of failed into it in an ironic way. I wanted to be a farmer growing up. I went to Fresno State, go Dogs. I grew up on a farm. My dad was a farmer, his dad was a farmer. So I went where you learn farming, which is the Valley. And I started working for a rice farmer up here in Sacramento, and had a friend back home, a close family friend, Shannon Grove, who was in the legislature, and started connecting with her as I lived up here in Sacramento. And she said, you really would be great at this politics thing, you should give it a try. And so I thought, wow, that's a big career change. I just, went to college to be a farmer. I'm kind of farming. I was in boots and Wranglers, I remember when I was talking to Shannon. And so I started looking around for a job. There was an unpaid internship for a nonprofit that advocated for foster care youth. And I thought, well, it's unpaid, I don't have any experience, but this is the way I'm gonna get my foot in the door to try this out. So I went and interviewed and I didn't get the job. And I thought, wow, I can't even get an unpaid internship with a college degree. And it turns out the woman who interviewed me called me 2 days later and said, you're way too qualified for this position, you need to call my husband. And her husband was a guy by the name of Matt Ruxrode, who was a political consultant in Sacramento. They interviewed me on a Friday and I started on Monday. In fact, I did the interview covered in rice patties, in Wranglers and boots. Now still work for one of the partners at that firm, Tom Ross. And again, as life would have it, very fortunate that pretty much everything I'm asked to do on a daily basis fits right in line with where I want to put my energy and my passions and my skill set. So it's just a good reminder that sometimes life has its own plan for you and you sort of always end up where you're supposed to end up. So very thankful to be up here with a couple people I actually look up to. Lars, probably, the head of the best political reporting class that's ever been in Sacramento. Steve actually was the press spokesperson for the first campaign I ever worked on, Proposition 10 in 2018. And if you know anything about politics, Dwayne's sort of a living legend. He's the campaign cowboy of California in the toughest races. So it's just, life's crazy, and it's kind of fun to be up here with all three of you.
All right, thank you. I should have mentioned that Tino has helped set Fresno State school record for the most number of Fresno State panelists this year, because we had another one of panelists last year, so thank you, Tino.
Go Dogs.
So let's, before we get into races and trends and elections, which I think is what I want to talk about, I want to talk a little bit about nuts and bolts of campaigns first. And so we've got experts up here. Can you tell us, when you are looking at handling candidate campaigns, Tino, I know you're doing more ballot measures, I think, this year, but I think, Steve, you've done ballot measures before, right? Dwayne, you've done ballot measures before. Can you tell us, kind of, how does that work? How do you go about choosing your clients that you're going to work for? What's kind of a little bit, you don't have to go too far into the weeds, but what's the step-by-step process for trying to set your candidate, your measure up for success in the campaign? What are the steps? You know, who do you consult? You know, what do you do to get across the finish line? And then for Laura's question, since you're a reporter, how do you go about covering these campaigns, getting up to speed on the candidate races, you know, setting yourself up for being able to cover the races and the ballot measures in, you know, a really thorough way? So, again, we can start with Steve.
Okay, I'm gonna sound really cynical and say everything begins with money. Whether it's a candidate or a ballot initiative. Typically with ballot initiatives in the state, it's now costing, correct me if I'm wrong here, $6 to $7 million just to get something on the ballot. And that's, if it's unpopular, it's even harder. Because if you see those folks that are standing in front of Target and Walmart, hey, can you sign this petition? They're getting paid anywhere from $2 to $6 for your signature. They don't do it because they love being out in front of Target. So somebody has to be behind that. And typically it's an organization, somebody who's super rich, like the guy who tried to propose dividing California up into 6 parts a couple times and 3 parts another time. Multi-millionaire apparently with nothing else to do with his money. And if it's an organization or a group that's behind some of the things we're seeing on the ballot this year, then they have to have the resources to do that. And what happens is they typically look around for someone who's going to run that campaign, and then they take a poll. Polls are very important in our business to see what the chances of failure, typically or passing, but typically when you do your first poll in a ballot measure, if it's not polling above 65%, you don't go through with it. Because the other side is going to clobber you over the head with millions of dollars, even if it's motherhood and apple pie, which I thought I was working on last year, which was Prop 30 to give tax credits to people to buy clean energy cars. We got clobbered. So you never can be too careful about that poll. And then you build the rest of the campaign team. But again, to finish that, go over that finish line, you need money, and lots of it. And even for a candidate, I'll let somebody else to talk about how the difference works with a candidate.
Well, candidates need money too, and lots of it, as Steve would say. When I look for candidates, sometimes they come to you, sometimes you go to them. There's a difference between sort of what you're looking for in a primary or a general. I tend to focus on general election seats in the sense that I like the combat between Democrats and Republicans. You know, war of ideas between the two. The Republican on Republican violence or Democrat on Democrat violence is really taking very thin things and making them very big things. It's much more entertaining on a personal level to get, if I'm a Republican, Democrats to cross over and vote for a Republican or get independents to vote for a Republican. It's a tougher job, really, than just demagoguing people. But there's a place for that too. You know, what we tend to do is, once we find a client, you kind of ask how we get them going. We put them through a process. I want to learn. It's very difficult to sell something unless you've, and it is, you know, this is a sales job. It's very difficult to sell something unless you know the thing very well. You know, you can't really sell Irish Spring unless you smelt the soap, you know, use the soap, whatever. And so we try to spend a lot of time with these people and then take their opinions and build them into something more coherent. What you don't want, and what I won't do, or usually won't do, is work for the person who says, I don't necessarily believe anything, what should I believe? That's what we don't need in the Republic right now. We actually need people who do believe in something.
It's very well put. Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing I look for when covering ballot measures is, especially the ones that are going to be important, because, you know, there will be silly ballot measures all the time. I'm sorry, not silly, I shouldn't call them that. There's one about like allowing ferrets to become pets, legalizing ferrets, that comes up every year, yes, and it doesn't have necessarily a lot of money, but it's one of those kind of fun things that recurs. But a lot of times it's never just as simple as like the blue team against the red team. It's this larger behind the scenes battle. So my first step when covering a ballot measure is figuring out what the story is here. And oftentimes it's like a years long battle over something. A really good example is the Fast Food Council. That was a piece of legislation that passed in California basically to establish a council to set like wages and working conditions for fast food workers. The industry, no surprise, didn't like it, and they couldn't get it killed in the legislature, so they come back with a ballot measure as a referendum. And that turned into a very expensive, massive fight between unions and industry. And what often happens with ballot measures is you end up kind of working out a deal between all parties behind the scenes. And that's what happened with the Fast Food Council. Another thing, a really important context to keep in mind this year, there's a proposed ballot measure regarding fentanyl. And I won't get too much into the specifics of the bill or what it would change, but that was something that died in the legislature last year. And the proponents were, furious about it, that it didn't get through. You can, talk about those politics all day long, but now they're doing a ballot measure. And some people are really upset about the fact that folks keep using the ballot measure process to kind of circumvent the legislative process. And you can argue that based on the merits of the ballot measure, but we do see, wealthy industries sometimes using the ballot measure, again, to, push back against things that they don't like from the legislature. So it's never just as simple as it seems on the surface, and ballot measures are becoming extremely important in California. I think Politico has actually talked about dedicating some individual reporters to ballot measures because it's so important and such a big part of politics here. And like Steve said, it's where all the money goes. It's millions of dollars. I think that, how much did they spend on the measure to legalize online gambling?
Well, to defeat.
Or sports betting, to defeat sports betting.
$250 million.
Yeah, a ton of money, just like ridiculous. So that's where all the action's at, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think they all summarized well that it all starts with viability. We're always just trying to find out what's the viability financially, from a support standpoint. I think campaigns it's important to build momentum too. It might not be quantifiable, but momentum. Can you build coalitions? Can you get third-party validators? Do you have some energy at the local level on the statewide ballot measures? I think Laura brought up a great point on the ballot measure space that I think is fascinating. We know the legislature is primarily dominated by a single party, the executive branch. All of our constitutional officers are Democrats, and so you've seen the rise in ballot measures as a form of direct democracy. And I think we've seen specific examples over the last 6 years when the electorate is fundamentally different than the legislature and far less progressive, actually. A couple examples: in 2019, we passed 1482, which enacted statewide rent control. And for the third time in 2024, voters are likely to reject a statewide rent control mandate. The legislature passed affirmative action, voters rejected affirmative action. The legislature passed Assembly Bill 5, which dealt with independent contractors, and in some way, voters approved a carve-out for certain contractors through Prop 22. In fact, to drive that point home even more, the chief author of AB 5 was Lorena Gonzalez, and Prop 22 passed in her assembly district. So you see an example where I think ballot measures are on the rise because the electorate is just far less progressive than I think the legislature has become, and there's an appetite for these types of initiatives, and quite frankly, there's a lot of money in them to convince voters there's an appetite for them. So it's a fascinating political dynamic we have where ballot measures overlay with the fourth largest economy in their public policy agenda.
All right, so let's get into some of the races. For right now, let's set aside the U.S. Senate race because I want to get into that. I think that's a fascinating race from many angles. But can you talk to us about, aside from that one, what races, ballot measures are you following closely? Not necessarily working on, maybe you're working on them, but maybe not, as kind of bellwethers of what voter trends are or other types of candidate trends, ballot measure trends. So, which maybe legislative races, congressional races are you paying the most attention to? Anybody can start.
Just on top of mind, talking about, the electorate being less progressive than the legislature, Prop 47 and public safety, I think, are going to be big issues this year. And we're actually seeing, I'm sure a lot of you were aware of Chesa Boudin, the progressive DA in San Francisco, got recalled. And we're seeing that kind of effort in some other places around the state. Pamela Price, the district attorney for Alameda County, which is Lake Oakland, is also facing a recall effort because people feel she hasn't, cracked down on criminals. There's also George Gascon in Los Angeles, the DA, who's pretty progressive there. I think that the public safety issue is going to be a big determining factor in a lot of races, and especially, we're even seeing Democrats who historically, in the last 10 years have enacted a lot of criminal justice reform measures, are now kind of stepping away from those because they're aware that voters are really, feeling anxious about perceptions about rising crime. Important caveat there that crime is not as bad as it was at its peak in the 90s. We do have to say that. But I think somehow some of these races, the way that they turn out is going to be really indicative of voters, appetite to changing Prop 47 as well, which could be a ballot measure that we see in November. So that's what I'm always watching for. That's my big factor.
What I'm working on this measure, so I'm particularly interested in the Taxpayer Protection Act. Every time we go out, Steve mentioned survey work, every single thing we do starts with survey work. We literally do public opinion research on what voters and residents are thinking, and the number one issue far and away is cost of living. Everything's getting more expensive. I saw a commercial, there's college kids in here, for Taco Bell, where they bragged that they had 10 items under $3. When I was in college, you could eat the whole menu for $3. And now their ad is literally, hey, come to us, we have something under $3. And so cost of living is at the top of mind for everyone. It's by far and away the dominant issue, and then you have to start peeling back the layers of what's contributing to the rising cost of living. Is it corporations not paying their fair share and a lack of revenue for the state to address our critical problems? Is it a state government that has a spending issue, that they're the fourth largest economy in the world, the budget's grown every single year, and yet Californians still wake up and they drive on bad roads and they feel like their public education system is failing? There needs to be more resources for public safety. And really the Taxpayer Protection Act is the litigation of that issue between the idea that corporations need to be paying more in tax revenue to fund government, and the idea that the government has plenty of resources and has done a bad job of managing their revenue. And so I'm particularly interested in that one because I think it's the right election to litigate that. 2024 seems to be a high turnout year. There's this growing NPP voter bloc, no party preference voter bloc, that oftentimes decides which side of that argument wins. And so, I think that's probably the headliner of the ballot measure space this year, and one that probably gives some indication if it can drive turnout on how some of these other things go.
Just to start, Laura is right in the sense that crime is not as bad as it was in the 80s here, but it was pretty wicked then. I mean, very wicked. Sacramento, I got mugged twice as a kid in downtown Sacramento, of all places. You don't see that as much anymore, but also we don't carry cash, right? But a lot of people where I live, which is just in East Sacramento, we don't lock our cars anymore because they get tossed. And to toss them, you break a window, and I think people are seeing these property crimes, and then the homelessness and the open use of drugs. If you walk just across the street, my building's right across the street. If you stand there for a while, you can see someone shoot up. It's like that, right? Or pass out, or do something else horrible. And it builds a mood of unsafety, even if it's safer than you think it is. I'm not sure how safe it is. I'm watching a few races. One of the races that I'm watching and working on is the LA DA race. Gascon is one of the most liberal DAs in the United States, and he's being challenged by a whole host of people. The general feeling is if you get one of those people in against him, they're probably going to beat him, because I don't know if you've been in LA. I'm sure many of you have. It's pretty bad, right? And there are many places where you don't feel safe. I lived in LA 25 years ago, and it was safer then than it is now, or at least it felt safer then. Maybe it could be because I'm old. Everything feels scary now. The other group of races that I'm watching are California 49, which is suburban San Diego and Orange County, and the Boss seat, which is kind of north of there. I can't think of the number, but it's like Huntington Beach. 47. Thanks. Those, I can never remember. They shouldn't change them every 10 years. I can't keep track. I can't remember. But those two races are similar and interesting in that, can Republicans re-win suburban voters that we've lost during the Trump years? And can we win Asian voters Can we start to move more Asian voters into our camp? Both of them have large groups of suburban and Asian voters. So that's one place I'm looking to see. We've lost those seats now, so we're seeing if we can take them back. Orange County used to be a machine for the right, and it's not anymore. The place where I have more personal interest is in the Valley, and that's the Valadeo seat and the Duarte seat. Duarte is 13. Those seats are fascinating to me, and we're working in the Duarte seat because we're watching the movement of Hispanic voters to the right. So I've been working in that seat now for 3 years, and we've seen particularly Hispanic men, but not exclusively Hispanic men, drifting to the right, drifting to be a Republican and even a Trump vote over cost of living and crime. And I'm actually going to tell us a little bit of story. I'll ask a question. Who doesn't like the prom? The prom, you know. Prom. Right. Well, the person who doesn't like the prom is the person who isn't asked to the prom, right? And I feel like the Republican Party for many years did not invite people who had come here more recently than the Mayflower. And we didn't come in the Mayflower, believe me. We're Irish. And so talking to maybe newer voters or people who've come here more recently and welcoming them to the country and saying things like, we're all in this together, saying what we really feel as opposed to not inviting them to the prom, it proves very successful. They like that, you know, and we believe it. And so we believe that within this cycle, we will be able to get a majority of Hispanics in almost any seat in the Valley. It's happening in rural areas first. It's happening in like Imperial County, Coachella. I mean, we're watching them move 2 or 3 points every time we poll. That's mine.
So I'm looking at a race that's on nobody's radar. And it's the Assembly District for Sacramento. And I think it's so amazing because it's what the future of California is going to look like. There's about, I think, 9 people have filed for it. There are about 6 serious candidates. 5 of them are gay. There's 3 people that wear the progressive, I'm Bernie Sanders' favorite kind of candidate. There's a gay Republican. We've never seen those. And nobody has emerged as like the favorite. And it's kind of crazy because usually in these races, someone is anointed by labor or by the business community. You shall win. And that's the way it happens. All the money goes there. But in this race, it's all over the map. And nobody knows these names of these people because they don't help post in the community, but it's not like, oh, I know Rosanna Herbeck because she's only run for head of the electric company, right? So it's really interesting, and there's lots of outside money coming in from charter schools, from labor, and from all these different groups that play statewide. But in this one, nobody had a runaway favorite. And to this day, I've gotten like 6 mailers from one candidate who's backed by the police unions and most of the businesses, but I've also gotten some 4 or 5 for somebody who used to be head of the ACLU. And so it's very disorienting for voters who usually walk in there and, oh, I've heard of that person, I know that person. And this is just like all out war, and it's kind of fun to watch. All but 2 of them are Democrats. And likely, because of this crazy, insane top 2 primary we have there, 2 of them are going to finish ahead. Now, typically, if there was 1 Republican and 7 Democrats, chances are that Republican's going to make it. Only because the rest of them are splitting up the pie and the Republicans have 1 piece. But at the last moment, another Republican filed in the race that nobody's ever heard of. And so voters, Republicans are even going to go into that ballot and go, God, I've never heard of these 2 people. Which one should I go for? So it's going to be really fascinating to see who emerges at the top of that pile.
You know, I'll add to that. Actually, the top 2 thing is interesting. In Assembly 36 right now, which it takes in Coachella and Imperial, way in hell out. Both sides are fighting over who's going to make it to the top 2. So the Republican Party and various factions of the Democratic Party are trying to manipulate it so that Republicans would want 2 Republicans in the runoff to make sure a Republican wins. The Democrats want a Democrat and a Republican, and they're spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars on this, what is a very silly process.
This is your cue, students, to get ready for your questions. I'm going to ask a couple more, and then we're going to send it out to you guys for much better questions than I can ask. You know, one of the things that struck me when you're talking about these races, ballot measures, comparing strategies and all that is the importance of polling. And I think we all are probably, or at least have some awareness that the accuracy of polling has been called into question. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'm just curious to know what your thoughts on, you know, Dwayne, you're talking about, you know, we're moving Hispanic voters 2-3%. How do you know this, right? How do you know that your polling, your initial polling on your measures and your candidates is accurate in a day and age when nobody out there wants to answer that cell phone, right? The pickup rate's less than 1% probably. But, you know, we all know about the 2016 presidential election, of course. And I think pollsters have tried to improve, but there still have been problems with that accuracy. So how do you know that you're getting good pollers?
Oh, me.
Anybody?
It's shocking how accurate polling is. So, on the natural, you would think maybe that it's not. It is harder to get samples. One thing we found that was a problem several years ago is that there were problems with it, you know, and so what we started doing is looking at who was actually picking up the phone, and it was the same people over and over, which leads to a screw up of the sample. You actually need randomness. And so one of the ways to correct this is to make sure the pollster actually gives you his list of who in the past they've contacted. But the polling is accurate, and you can see it because we'll track, you know, for months in some of these big congressional races, and we'll be able to predict the numbers down to, you know, 3 or 4 points. It's not perfect, certainly, but it does work. What also works is analytics, which is a little creepier. What the analytics does is instead of looking at you as a demographic, say I would be in the demographic white male Republican, 45 to 65 years old, you know, and you kind of look at them, you know, most of them are gravity or whatever. Read the hard paper.
Use Irish Spring.
Yeah, that's right. Long-lasting scent, my friend.
Yeah.
Analytics looks at you individually. And so, for instance, I looked up my score, analytics score, in the company that we used the other day, and it literally predicted almost all of my behavior. My voting behavior, my cultural behavior. The only thing it got wrong was that it thought I was Catholic. And I thought about that, and it's because I drive my kids to Catholic school. And yeah, Europe has actually banned a lot of that stuff, and you know, you can think it's a good idea or a bad idea, but it does exist, and it is accurate.
On a related subject, there's lots of fights about internet privacy in the California legislature. If you want to follow those, that's going to be a big one too. I think for like journalist purpose and polls, like there's so many of them, and like the methodology, people argue about like the right way and who to talk to and how to weight things. And for our coverage, we really try and be judicious about what polls we cover. We tend to kind of stick to the big ones like PPIC and Berkeley IGS. There are a lot of times like campaigns will come to me and say like, oh my God, we have this new poll that says our candidate's ahead. And I'm like, you don't say, that's crazy. So like with those, I always am like, love and light to you, I'm not gonna write about that. And that's just because it's, hard to kind of be the arbiter of like what's the most appropriate like methodology. And I think for campaigns, internal polls are extremely useful, and you always need to be tracking like who cares about what messages and where to direct your fundraising dollars towards and things like that. It can really like cause kind of panic. Speaking about like races that we're covering, in David Valadeo's seat, there's a big fight between Democrats there. A former assembly member, Rudy Salas, was kind of expected to be the returning challenger. He's faced this kind of unexpected challenge from another Democratic state legislator, Melissa Hurtado. And Melissa Hurtado hasn't raised a lot of money. She has good name ID. But all of a sudden in January, the Democratic establishment starts pouring millions of dollars into this district to make sure that Rudy Salas gets into the top 2. And, I haven't seen it, but, conventional wisdom would say they saw some polling and went, oh crap, we gotta spend money right now. And so that's where we tend to see it and we tend to cover it. We try and be judicious about, ringing the alarm bells and saying this candidate's gonna win or this candidate's losing, so.
I spend a lot of my time in the communications and the campaign going to sort of different kind of polls called a focus group, which basically you put a bunch of voters, uninformed voters, into a room and stand behind a one-way mirror, and you have a pollster talk to them about issues in the race you're going on. And boy, you really learn something. Listen to what people think before they hit the ads, because the information you get from those groups, you sort of try to tap into those feelings, not just the number in a poll, but real feelings. And like last year, I went to a number of them 2 years ago when we were doing the rent control campaign, and the poor pollster just started asking a little bit about homelessness, and oh my God, people were like screaming, they were like up armed, and we walked out of there going, oh my God, people are lightning hot about this issue. We better talk about this all the time. And which we sort of can't get in a normal poll. So these are like super important. And all high-level campaigns have these, and they're super expensive, but they're so valuable. If you ever have a chance to go to work for a pollster, it's the most fascinating thing you can do, because to watch people, when you sit there and then you test out your ideas, the focus groups, and they hate your idea, and you're like, oh, we thought that was brilliant. It's so frustrating sometimes. But no, they're super important in the campaign.
Yeah, I'll just, in closing, I think Steve put a nice bow on it. There's the quantitative side, which is the public opinion research, and the qualitative side, which is the focus groups. And there is a little bit of art. I'll be a little more artistic about it. I think it's really easy to get a survey back and use it as a horse race, if you will. Message A is better than message B, and it's not really that way. It's not that transactional. It's more of a roadmap. Okay, message A moves these voters in this way, and message B moves these voters. Oh, and think back to the focus groups. Remember when the moderators started bringing up cost instead of price? They really reacted to the word cost better than the word price. We should talk about it that way. So I think it's the infusion of sort of all of these data points that you collect, and the survey work can be somewhat of a comfort blanket, that when you have an intuition or a sense or a feeling, and it's backed up by some quantitative data, it feels really, really good. But yeah, it's the most important tool, and I cannot think of the last time we spoke with the prospective client. The first thing we didn't say is, we need to do survey work. It's the first thing we got to do. Before anything, before you think of a name, everyone wants to think of a name and get a logo and appoint a campaign chair and do all the fun stuff. But until you've done public opinion research, both qualitative and quantitative, you really don't, you're kind of shooting in the dark, and that's not a good place to be in politics.
Can I ask one more question to your point, Steve, about homelessness being a big issue? There was a ballot measure last cycle about legalizing online sports betting, but the way that they advertised it was as solutions for homelessness, because they were going to tax sports betting and funnel that into a homelessness fund. And I think the conventional wisdom there is homelessness is such a big deal, people are going to really want this, but that measure was handily defeated.
Yes. That may or may not be the focus group.
Sorry.
But, that was the intent, but voters saw right through it, and it didn't help that the other side had 5 times as much money.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious, Steve and Dwayne and everyone, I've seen a rising, there's a sense of skepticism from voters that, one, money's going to solve homelessness, and two, that any candidate actually knows. I think we saw this maybe in 2018. Before homelessness, it was wildfires. Everything that we were raising taxes for was going to go to wildfires. The state was burning. It was top of mind for voters. And so, in ballot measures, we call these ornaments, right? You have the tree of your policy, and then what's in it for voters when a voter goes to the ballot box. And in this case, to legalize sports wagering, which, by the way, is really only popular with white males from 25 to 35. Everyone else pretty much thinks it's a bad idea to give gambling to people on their phones. And so we thought, well, if we make the money go to homelessness, that's what's in it for voters. And I think there's a skepticism even now in this general election cycle. I get the mail every single day that candidate X is going to solve homelessness, or we need more money for homelessness. And I think voters, and maybe even you all, have seen we have a record investment in homelessness solutions, and the problem doesn't seem to be getting any better. So is it a spending issue or an accountability issue, or is it a mental health crisis? So that's been a fascinating evolution of that conversation relative to homelessness.
Thank you. So let's get to a U.S. Senate race. So in my class, just a couple weeks ago, my students can tell me if I'm wrong. I asked the students, how many of you have heard of Steve Garvey before this race? How many raised their hands? One student out of 32 raised their hands had ever heard of Steve Garvey. So let's get into this race. We have PPIC just came out with their latest, I think last poll before the election. We're not going to see another one. We have Adam Schiff in the lead, 24. Katie Porter and Steve Garvey are pretty dead heat, 18, 17%, I think.
It's like 19 Porter, 18 Garvey.
19, 18. And then Barbara Lee is, I think, down at 9% or something like that. So, what is interesting for you about this race? What do you see happening here? I mean, one question I have, because we have the race for the partial term, we have the race for the full term, a whole 2-month partial term. Is it possible we could get a couple of three different candidates in the partial term and the full term race, right? Maybe Adam Schiff and Steve Garvey in the full term, and Adam Schiff and Katie Porter in the partial term, or some shenanigans like that. So what are you kind of seeing in this race, and where do you think it's headed?
Yeah, you cover it, Laura.
I'm so sorry, I don't totally know what the scenario could be with a partial vote. Maybe these, giants of industry can tell me more about this. I don't know, if Adam Schiff is like pulling so much, further ahead than the other candidates, would it not be crazy to think that he might also win I don't think somebody's gonna, if you see it on your ballot, it's like full term, all the candidates, partial term, all the other candidates. I don't think you're gonna pick different senators for those, races. I will say, the Steve Garvey factor is super interesting. The fact that he's one of the more viable statewide Republicans you've had in a while. He, this is just a good example of name ID. Maybe you guys don't know a lot about him. I certainly don't. I didn't grow up in California. I'm not a baseball fan, and I'm, in my 20s, so I don't know who Steve Garvey is. But I do now. But that's the population that tends to vote, right? Is older people, and he certainly, that's a big factor when it comes to just getting started. That's how you get people to donate to you. And he did have a relatively impressive fundraising haul the first 6 weeks of 2024. I think it was 1.5 million, which is pretty good for where he's at in the race. So I would love to hear others' opinions.
Well, as the only Democrat on the no, listen, the Republicans have zero bench here in California for an office like this. The shot of them winning this is somewhere below 0%, right? So they nominate somebody they think is going to be like Arnold Schwarzenegger, that everybody knows and gonna like, and he was a famed baseball player. But the fact is, not a lot of people know who he is. He's got no money. His qualities as a candidate on the trail has been not good. Let's just say I'm being generous. But here's the thing about this race. Adam Schiff had so much money, he could afford to blow it on trying to elevate this guy, so that's who he's going to be in the top 2. And he didn't spend it attacking the other Democrats. He spent it on elevating a Republican. And Katie Porter was like, you can't do that, that's outrageous. This is ridiculous. And then she did it herself a couple weeks later, right? But it's just, to me, I hate the top 2 soapbox again. And this is what happens where elections are being manipulated with money and with a kind of scenario where, there's a good chance that this race will be over in a few weeks in March and not in November. And that'll deprive a lot of people of voting for the candidate that got millions and millions of votes. And to me, that's just undemocratic. End of soapbox.
Well, I think the soapbox you ended on, though, is an important one, Steve, which is this race going to be over in March? And as someone who doesn't really live in the candidate space, we're always looking what's at the top of the ticket and what's driving turnout. Conventionally, I would say ballot measures don't tend to drive turnout. Now, I know last year with Proposition 1, and even this year with ACA 5, I think there's an attempt to drive turnout with the ballot measure space. But what's the top of ticket race in California this year? What's exciting? What are you watching every week, trying to find out what's going to happen and going to the polls for? And usually in most states, it's a competitive U.S. Senate race. The presidential race is essentially over when it comes to California in a week, so that's not driving folks to the poll. Most folks think in November it's already over for the presidential race, and they're pretty confident which side California is going to vote for. So how does that impact turnout? And we've had a couple of weird turnout years over the last couple of cycles. If you remember, Governor Newsom faced a recall in the fall of 2021, and a lot of people actually kind of looked at that as his re-elect campaign, and turnout actually went down in our last gubernatorial election. And so, you know, in California, where high turnout elections are favorable to a lot of the prevailing party and a lot of the prevailing interests in the state, you know, what is the U.S. Senate race going to do in terms of turnout for all of these really other important races, Assembly, Senate, constitutional offices, all of these other sorts of things? And so I'm a little disappointed that we don't have something at the top of the ticket to make sure lots and lots of folks are engaged and energized to vote. And I think that's really where the U.S. Senate rate has a broader impact on November, even if it's over in March.
And we're on track to have the lowest turnout ever for a presidential primary, despite the fact that everybody's got a ballot in their mailbox.
And I think that's what's so fascinating as you look at the narratives. When we went to an all vote by mail, and we actually, people forget, trialed this in 2018. We did 6 counties, received a mail ballot, and then when 2020 during the pandemic, we went to an all vote by mail, and everyone thought that's going to take voter turnout through the roof. We do motor voter, which is you get registered to vote at the DMV, so we have one of the highest voter registration percentages in the state, and that, just to Steve's point, hasn't been the case. And funny how everything in politics is connected. Steve mentioned and Laura mentioned collecting signatures. That's based on gubernatorial turnout. So you have to collect 10% of the last gubernatorial turnout election. It's actually lower threshold this year to collect signatures for a ballot measure than it was in 2020, and that seems to just not make any sense based on the priorities that our states have for making sure more people are voting.
Let me cut you off real quick, Dwayne, then I'll send it back to you. Students, you want to start lining up at the microphone, which still doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
We got to work it, okay. So if you could have one single file line at the microphone, and then we'll get to your questions here in a second. And Dwayne, I'll send it back to you, so please give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll comment on something that you closed with, which is I actually
I got no questions.
think that having elections on election day was a good thing. It's a communal activity in our republic that we all share. You all walk down there with your neighbors. You know, all of these things that we're losing in a society where we don't do things together anymore. Frankly, I think that having a 30-day voting period makes campaigns more negative. When everybody voted on election day, my negative campaigning, or comparative campaigning, you know, started 10 days out. Well, when it's a 30-day voting period, I'm starting a month and a half out on that stuff. It also makes campaigns a lot more expensive. So I don't think I don't think your mail ballots are going to increase turnout at all. It's the person's interest in it that determines whether they vote or not. And then as to the actual question, I think that the runoff is likely to be Republican Garvey and the congressman. I like that there's a Republican and a Democrat likely to be in the runoff, because that way people can experience disparate ideas. The war of ideas is vital to making a republic function properly, and if you only hear one side all the time, you never really get the opportunity to change your mind. And so, you know, I'd like to see more debates of people at our top of the ticket, and, you know, air our ideas. If you don't like our ideas, that's fine, you know, vote the other direction, but at least you hear both sides.
Okay, we'll start with questions. Give us your name, your school, your brief question, because we've got a lot of people to get through. Very brief.
Very brief.
And we'll limit it to one question per student, so make it your best one. Go ahead.
Cool. My name is Connor. I go to LMU, and my question is, what is a common challenge that you've encountered while running a campaign that surprised you, and how did you address it?
Common challenge. Go.
Common challenge. The guy tells you he's as clean as the day is long, and he never is, and they never want to tell you what they actually did. You have to sort of be their priest. You know, I'm not going to talk about what's in your closet, but that happens about 50% of the time, and then you learn to sort of deal with it and understand that the other side may come after you on it. but the answer to that problem is to be upfront to start with, because it's a lot harder to deal with it when the television ads in the mail are saying, oh, by the way, this guy put his kids up for adoption, last year, and they were 14 years old or something, whatever he did. I haven't run into that one yet.
So is one of your vetting processes, are you doing a thorough check on social media now before you decide to go? I would assume.
Both us and our opponent, yeah. And I would say that 50% of the time people say asinine. I say asinine things on social media all the time, Steve knows. People say things which are disqualifying for office. So they get heated or drunken and they say stupid stuff.
Also, that's why you hire like OPPO researchers to you'll hire somebody to dig up dirt on your person so that the other person, or what the other person's going to use. It's kind of like discovery in the court, yeah.
But I'll say this, it is important to know these things. I'll go back to the soap example. People go to the store and they look and there's Ivory and there's Irish Spring, okay? And they say, great, Irish Spring makes it smell like an Irish morning, and Ivory, I think it floats in the tub. But what they really want to know also, when they're making a comparative choice, is which one gives you a terrible rash. And that's what politics is about. Politics is combative. The Anglo-American system of politics is combative, just like our legal system.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a challenge? Okay, let's move on. Next question.
Hi, my name is Samara Williams. I'm a sophomore at St. Mary's College, and I know we mentioned some things about intent and implementation when it comes to policies and try to get people to come to the polls and voting. Is it possible that voters aren't voting because they just don't believe in the process, because you see intent and then you see implementation, and how that doesn't always look like the same thing?
So apathy, being turned off by politics.
I mean, in general, I think institutional trust is down with churches and education and politics, and you see that. And we've had a few candidates sow some doubt in the electoral system in recent years. That can't help. So please.
No, I think it's not just happening in candidate spaces. I'll go back to where my little corner of the world is in ballot measures, and I'll go back to my example of Taxpayer Protection Act. And a lot of people think that measure is anti-tax, that we don't want to see taxes raised, that we want to stop taxes, and there's an element of that. But really, when we go out and we talk to voters about the measure, voters aren't mad that their taxes are raised at a historic rate. We pay among the highest gas, sales, and income taxes in the nation. What they're mad about is the accountability behind the tax dollars. You're telling me the gas tax is to fix roads, but I don't really feel like my roads are any better. You're telling me that these dollars are going to fix homelessness, but I'm pretty sure there's still homelessness, even though we spent $30 billion on it. So I think your question is, do voters feel like what they're being sold is what actually is happening? And is that driving a lack of motivation or empowerment to participate in the process? And I certainly think, in my experience, my observation of talking to voters and seeing survey work, is there's a large lack of trust in our institutions right now that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. And we have to address that. And that's a systematic and fundamental approach to being accountable and transparent in how we do things. So I absolutely think that's the case.
How would you guys promote that accountability?
Electing people who are more accountable, I suppose, right? It's all in the voters' hands, supposedly.
Also in your hands.
Yeah, I was going to say, cover it.
Well, yeah, my job, I suppose, is to, point out where people are not, following through on things. And homelessness is the issue you keep coming back to. And I think a lot about something that Mayor Darrell Steinberg says, where, he deals a lot with homelessness as a mayor, and I'm sure Steve and others have lots of opinions on how he deals with homelessness.
I was going to say, that's
yeah, but he talks a lot about something I think is pretty wise. There's a two-test system, right? Which one is when you're dealing with homelessness, the first test is, are people getting off the street? And you could argue that yes, they're taking people off the street, they're getting them temporary or more permanent shelter, they're giving them help. Darrell Steinberg would argue that there are, several hundred people who are getting that help. The second test is if people feel like there's something being done. And that's really critical, and that's where you're going to have that disconnect between we're throwing all this money at this, but I don't feel like anything's different, to your point.
Yeah, but we also have a little bit of accountability in the state because of the recall.
Yes.
If you don't really like somebody, you can take them out of office, and we're seeing it at all different levels too. And also in Michigan, there's a lot of Democrats who are upset with the president about his stance on Israel and Gaza, and they're going to send a message at polling booths by voting for uncommitted rather than for him. So there are processes in the system to try to hold politicians in check, but I agree with you that I think a lot of people have lost faith because politicians notoriously overpromise and underdeliver.
Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Trevor. I'm from LMU. This question is more geared towards Steve, but I was wondering, in your opinion, what are the most effective strategies for navigating contentious political environments and achieving bipartisan cooperation?
That one's for you, Steve.
Well, it's kind of funny. I worked in the legislature for a while when, Kevin McCarthy was recently the Speaker of the House, and the Speaker of the Assembly was a Democrat. They got along really well. They hung out together. They would joke together. I always looked at Kevin McCarthy and what happened to him? Because he was the kind of guy who was collegial. They worked together on bills and legislation. Something happens when they drink that Potomac water because they go crazy. But in the California legislature, Republicans sort of have to work with Democrats, otherwise they're not going to get anything done. We saw it in the fentanyl bill with Shannon Grove last year. All right,
Human trafficking.
human trafficking. Okay, that bill was had no signs of life until the Republicans made enough of a huff and puff about it, and she got a leading Democrat to get behind it. And suddenly, the skies opened, there was bipartisanship, and the bill passed. Rare example, but you see it every once in a while. And the key is, the pressure of the media on that particular issue, the pressure of some interest groups like law enforcement, and the pressure of people who wanted something done on an issue. So, it happens, not a lot, but it does happen, more than you might think.
I think one of the bigger revelations I had as a political journalist, you see on TV people get really polarized, they're taking really aggressive shots at, across the aisle and really demonizing the other group. But when cameras are off, they're all, a lot of them are friends. They go to each other's fundraisers and parties and they're palling around in the back. And that's not to say that there aren't real disagreements there. But I think a lot of the kind of polarization we see to a certain level nationally is performative. And people don't want to see that. They might feel good watching Fox or CNBC in the moment. They feel like their team is hammering back. But I think largely voters want to see results and they want to see things get done and they want to see bipartisanship. So that's my observation.
I would only add that I think we might need to update the term bipartisan to tripartisan. I mean, in California, we really have 3 political parties. In fact, for a time, no party preference, or what we identify as independent voters, had a larger registration share than Republicans. Republicans just now became the 2nd largest party again in California. And the NPP voter is probably the most powerful voting bloc, and I'm not breaking any ground here saying where independents swing determine elections, but it's important now that if you talk in a partisan lens, especially from the right, you really isolate the opportunity to talk to voters who are more moderate, who may feel disenfranchised by either party. And to Dwayne's point about analytics, we have these things called wrong track NPPs. They may be independent voters who disagree with the direction of the state, but don't go as far as to identify themselves as Republicans. So if you're looking to pass certain issues, that's a really important voting bloc to talk about. So we're probably more than any other state a 3-party system in terms of how that's made up, with obviously Democrats dominating it. So it's a fascinating that we have 3 little buckets and pockets we often have to talk to.
Thank you, appreciate it. Hello everyone, my name is Lawrence. I'm a junior at USC, and as an international relations major, I just want to ask what the role of foreign policy plays in California politics, if there is any role, just given California's status as the 5th largest economy in the world, and also its cultural importance as well.
And this might be, obviously it comes into play in the Senate race. Senate race because they're dealing with foreign policy, but I would think that the Israel-Palestinian conflict has entered into maybe local level races and endorsements of ceasefires, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, California as a subnational state can't do anything, right? You can do kind of symbolic things like Governor Newsom went to Israel, I think met with, folks on both sides there. But yeah, I think certainly international politics is important to a lot of voters here. This is something we've seen really divide the Democratic Party recently with the fighting in Gaza and Israel. And yeah, that's filtered down to every level. You saw the Democratic Socialists of America, which is a group that, I don't want to misstate anything here, but I believe that they've, called for a ceasefire and been among the more progressive groups supporting Palestine here. And there was a point shortly after the October 7th attacks where, folks were pointing out which politicians had been endorsed by DSA. They were pointing out everything from like city council up to, congressional races. And so that was something that really, you could argue has nothing to do with California, aside from the fact that we do have groups here who are extremely invested in that, and we have a very diverse state. We have Palestinians, we have Jewish people, we have Israelis, we have lots of, groups that care about this very deeply and want to see their politicians, even if they have no control, they want to see them, take a stance on these issues. And that can be extremely tricky for politicians because they're like, I'm a city council person, I can't do anything about this, but they're expected to speak to their constituents. It's tough.
When you have a spare moment, definitely look up the Democratic Socialists of America's website and look at what they believe in, and you may be amused or terrified. The biggest thing, I think, which impacts the races that I work on here is foreign policy-wise, or I guess it's a combination of foreign and domestic policy, is immigration. It's ripping the country apart, it's ripping parties apart, and really, in state government, there's limited things that you can do one way or the other on immigration. I think Texas probably pushes it further than some. California probably pushes it the other direction. But it is definitely, in my day-to-day life, besides the Israeli-Palestinian question, it's probably the thing that that we have to deal with on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Yep, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Josie. I am a junior at Fresno State. Go Dogs. My question is there anything any of y'all would wish to change in polling? Like anything to benefit it, or do you think it's fine the way it is?
I'll take the Fresno State question first. I would someone from Fresno State to ask a question. And you use y'all, so I just feel right at home. I have a joke that, and I'm not sure it'll play with this crowd, but I recently bought a home with my wife, and we had to hire an electrician. And I've hired 3 different electricians, and every time a new electrician comes, they talk about what a bad job the prior electrician did. What a hack job. And sometimes in polling, my recommendation to change it is stop using different pollsters unless you're validating your tests. I've found there's some consistency in using the same pollsters. Now, on a more scalable approach, I think the fundamental challenge we're facing is representative samples. So, we talked about this a little earlier, getting respondents. We mentioned people don't pick up their phones, so we have to go online to get respondents. Well, online respondents tend to skew younger, they tend to skew a little bit more liberal. So how does that influence a representative sample if we're polling in Bakersfield for the Vince Vaughn race, where it's older, white Republicans? So I think we've got to find a way in polling to continue to find good sample sizes and do so in a way that's not implicitly biased and isn't influencing the results. And I think that's where focus groups come in, a little bit of observation, intuition, experience. I really never look at polling as sort of the Bible or a suicide pact. It's more of a roadmap. It's a tool in our tool belt when we're trying to identify roadmaps to victory. But I think the biggest challenge polling is going to face moving forward is, especially with the rise of AI and how that'll be implemented, how do we get honest, representative sample sizes back?
The only thing I would add is I would like to see more consistency in the way some of the pollsters ask questions in their samples, because sometimes just the way a question is worded makes an enormous difference. And I know when I work on a lot of issues, we try to load the questions, right, so we get the favorable response. But different pollsters have different ways of asking questions, and you're like, what if you had said it this way, it would have been that, So that's my constant gripe with pollsters. You didn't ask the right question.
Yeah. Or all present the information the same way, right? It's like I know on slide 14 I'm going to find what I need and someone else will find.
That's also why it's important for journalists to go through the crosstabs and see how they worded the question, because somebody might be like, 80% of people support kicking puppies, and it's like, well, how did you word the question? The question was like, do you support hitting or kicking puppies? It's like, I don't support hitting, so.
Yeah, puppies with rockets on their back.
Yeah, or something like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kemla Soleil. I'm second year at Fresno State also. And my question is kind of centered toward Laura about journalism and how, but anyone's free to answer, of course, but how over the years we've seen how journalism has changed and how it's become more polarized and become more mistrusted between the public. For example, like through issues such as, for example, Israel and Gaza, how like certain even like titles, how using the term dead instead of killed, it, like sends a different message to the readers and how like values everything's become and sort of someone's very perspective, or how you've noticed the shift in the challenges that have come with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super fair that the public would want to hold journalism accountable like any other institution. I mean, if you feel like media is misleading you, I think that's a fair complaint. You know, I can't speak for all journalists. I understand that like there's you know somewhat of a movement amongst journalists to kind of own your biases, and you know like nobody is completely unbiased, but I still really think it's important to stay as neutral as possible, or at very least like give you know both sides their perspective. I think it's a shame. Like it's like such a critical institution to democracy, and if we aren't earning people's trust, like what's it good for then? Otherwise, we're just like tabloid writers writing the most salacious nonsense. And so it's like not always easy. It's much easier said than done to kind of like take criticism and you know internalize it and try and improve. But like it's so critical. So yeah, I really am sad to see that people don't trust it as much.
You hit my fetish here. Maybe that's an interesting word to pick. I don't have any filter, guys. Yeah, trust in mainstream media is the lowest it's been since polling started. I'm deeply concerned about that because I believe that a functional republic requires an aggressive media that sort of at least is viewed from a neutral prism, and when it's not viewed from a neutral prism, you get people seeking other sources of news. Now they couldn't do that back in the 80s and the 90s so much because, well, you either didn't have a computer or your computer was so slow that you would brain yourself trying to read the news. But now it's easy for people to go and get news from things that I would consider illegitimate. Propaganda, as a matter of fact. And I think that that's dangerous because they're getting warped views of the world. You know, my mother was a moderate Republican, you know, many years, and then began getting her news basically from Facebook. And it's radicalized her, not to the left, to the right. But you hear all these things that are just crazy, and people don't necessarily understand that this is not legitimate news. And so I believe that we should do everything we can to encourage the society of journalists to report from the center to the degree that they can, air both sides. By the way, she does a fantastic job at that. Like of all of the reporters in California, I'd say she is strictly down the middle and strictly neutral. And if she wasn't, I would say that she wasn't. Because I have no filter.
No, I would also say, yeah, like what's it called, validation bias or whatever it is so big. And so, yeah, you could go and read, like my parents read Time magazine all the time, and it was just like political profiles that were pretty like mainstream, but like my dad got access to YouTube. And there are studies on this that the YouTube algorithm will show you more things to the right. And so if you're seeing more videos of like this ex, you know, like Navy SEAL who says that the media is lying to you, like you're gonna feel like, oh wow, that guy must know what he's talking about. Like to a certain degree, like the illegitimate information does also sow just like distrust of the media. I see this on TikTok too. Kids are getting this. Kids are getting this, like the media is collaborating against you, and it's like, we're not like skilled enough to do that. Like, yeah, like I drive like a 2010 CRV. I'm not like dominating the world, you know? So it's crazy how much just like access to all this information, because it feels weirdly, I think, good for people to like, you know, they feel powerful if they feel like they know what's actually being done to them, or if they know that there's like somebody behind the curtain, they feel a little bit more control over life. So, all right, I'll stop.
Yeah, and then just one thing I want to mention, the demise somewhat of the Capitol Press Club. When I was the press secretary, you know, when dinosaurs ruled the earth, we could fill half this room with reporters. Now, if you have a press conference, you don't get nearly that many, and that's a reduction in coverage and reduction in what's covered. So I think a lot of politicians think they can get away with a lot more now because there are not as many reporters holding them accountable. And I think that's really been the biggest disaster. And there was some talk when Schwarzenegger was elected, all these people from all around the world came to cover California politics. And they got really bored after about 4 months and they all went away again. And then we've seen the gradual shrinking of the press corps. Unfortunately, Laura's outlet has invested very heavily in Sacramento. But the number of reporters is, nothing like it was. And TV, boy, even in Sacramento, there I think one dedicated reporter to politics among the 3 or 4 TV stations that just covers the Capitol, not having to go cover the weather. So that says a lot right there. And I think we need a lot more reporters.
Can I say one more thing on this point? Sorry, then I'll be done. I will say that unsubscribing or not subscribing to a newspaper because you don't agree with what they're covering is not going to make the coverage better. I know that people do that a lot and you can, vote with your dollars or whatever, but a big source of this problem is lack of money for these, newspapers. Maybe Dwayne's going to disagree with me here.
No, I subscribe to the Sacramento Bee, which I virulently oppose. In fact, I subscribe to a number of papers, and I think you should subscribe to the paper, and I think that it's a good thing to read the paper in the morning, and if you disagree with them, you can find them online and carp at them.
And I'll take just a conflicting position. I actually think the idea that media is biased is completely overblown, personally. I don't subscribe to that narrative, and I think that we are far too invested in getting our source of news from national publications, and I can tell you right now, if you think the California media is biased towards this current administration, you have not read Laura, you have not read Ashley Zavala, Mackenzie Mays, Emily Hoban at the San Francisco Chronicle, who quite frequently holds our governor accountable, Alexei Kosov, who is not shy about creating some transparency around the access we have to the governor as a press corps. So I think it's important to read all sources of news, but localized news, and this goes to Laura's point about making sure they have resources to be solvent, localized news is really, really good right now. And if you find, I follow Laura on Twitter, I follow Alexi, Mackenzie, these folks on Twitter are dynamite, and so I think localizing your news, finding out through their Substack, their Twitter, where they're writing, what they're writing, and finding folks you like and you don't like, to Dwayne and Marcus Bertone, then I think you have a really good chance of sort of using data points to form your own opinion.
We do have a journalism panel later on today with at least one of the people that Tino mentioned, so.
Our press corps in Sacramento right now, I think, is dynamite, so.
Thank you.
Also, sorry, you're basically.
Yeah,
Okay.
We can check after.
Laura's gonna talk about this.
yeah, we can talk after.
Hello, my name is Michael Sanders Denry, Nobody Perfect, Fullerton College. Jeff, you asked the question about polling, going back to polling and sampling. The way you stated that polling, you guys look at who's responding. My question is, how do you guys combat the non-responsive biasness? Or when you have certain responses, certain questions, how do you guys combat that responsive bias that comes from these polls? It's just an algorithm you guys use, other callbacks to compute the numbers for your numbers, or get more accurate numbers to combat the non-responsive.
Yeah, I get it. Well, sometimes what they do is they weigh polls, or they balance them. And that means if you didn't get enough of a certain subgroup, whatever that subgroup, say you didn't get enough Republicans, you move the numbers a little bit to indicate what you think they would have done more of. That's the subjective aspect, I guess, to this. And when you don't, one of the problems you sort of hit on in there is if you don't get enough proper samples, you pay more and you get proper samples.
Funny how that works.
Yeah, you expand into what Tino was saying, which was, which is, you're getting polling on text, you're getting it on the internet, you're getting it on the phones. Back in the old times, like say my grandfather's time period, polling was actually conducted door to door, which we may move back to at a certain point, but then you take a $25,000 poll and suddenly it's $40,000, and people wonder why there's so much money in politics, which there is only a reasonable amount of money in politics.
Okay, next question, thank you. We got several more people to get through.
Hello, my name is Aiden. I'm from Fullerton College. Donald Trump is the presumptive Republican nominee. given his consecutive wins in state primaries. So I was wondering, do Californian voters see Trump as a drag on other Republicans on the ballot as much as they do Biden and other Democrats?
So,
Off the record.
no, yeah. Trump is helpful for the Republican Party in some places and unhelpful in others, and it depends on where you are. You know, in Montana, he's helpful. He's less helpful, I would say, in California. I would say that in most of our seats that we poll, which are swing seats again, Trump is not popular, and he does weigh on Republican candidates, and I don't envision that changing. The interesting thing about it, though, is this. In the, every party is made up of pots, right? Like pot of, there's these people and these people and these people. One of the things that Trump has changed is that the working class segments of America are becoming more Republican, while the highly educated upper middle classes are becoming more Democrat. So what you're going to see, and Trump has changed the party, that is not going to change. Those two things are going to keep happening. You're going to see very interesting policy changes among the parties over the next several years as the Republicans adapt to being more of a working class party. We may see more friendliness towards unions, for instance. And you're going to see changes in the upper middle class Democrats. Maybe they're going to be a little more hostile to unions or a little friendlier to big business. That's what I got.
Good job. Okay, all right, next question.
Hello, my name is Genevieve Monroe. I'm from St. Mary's College. My question is in regards to unprecedented polling trends. What can a candidate do to reaffirm their place in a race and reaffirm faith of their constituents?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. Part of the work that we do is this sort of insider term called coalition building, and I think more than ever there are a few institutions left. We just talked about how some institutions are losing credibility, some are gaining them. Small businesses are really, really credible and trusted right now coming off the COVID pandemic. Veterans are still a really trusted institution, and so I think whether it's a candidate or a ballot measure space, the more you can wrap yourself up in some third-party validators that voters take their cues from. Steve mentioned sometimes we're going to the polls now and we don't know what the ballot measure does. We could probably have a whole panel on whether or not the ballot titles and summaries are telling folks what the measure does, who these candidates are, and so I think a lot of folks look to an institution or a name they trust, a former elected, the Small Business Association, the NAACP. And so I think when voters create a platform that encourages collaboration and you can create some really good infrastructure to amplify your third-party supporters, you can really reaffirm what it is you care about. I hate to use this term, but they become a little bit of dog whistles, like, oh, if that person's supported by law enforcement, that means they're pro-public safety. If that person's supported by the ACLU, they're pro, gay rights or whatever the issue may be. And so I think when you take all the polling and you see what your best messages are and what voters like about you, the next best thing you could do is to find some messengers outside of yourself as a candidate or outside of yourself as a ballot measure committee that help buoy and elevate that support, or opposition, depending if you're opposing something.
Yeah, for Democrats, you almost will always see teachers, firefighters, and nurses for fill in the blank of the name, because those are the three most respected professions in California. It's their unions, it's not what is them, but their unions have endorsed that candidate, and that validates them for people who like teachers, nurses, and firefighters, which is everybody.
Which is a lot of people.
Okay, thank you.
It works, right?
Yes, that works.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I have a question specifically, it's open to everybody, specifically to Tiara, and this is Gordon.
Your name and
Yes, my name is Huang Ho. I'm from Fullerton College. So yeah, my question is that the reality is that right now Orange County is becoming kind of a losing battleground for the GOP, and there's been talks of getting more votes from the Asian American, like APDA community. And the fact is, however, there has been the poll says less than 50% of the APDA community are reached out or contacted regarding that. So what is your kind of potential explanation for that, or what is there any way for the other side to exploit that?
Well, the API community is certainly a target in Orange County and anywhere else that any community that votes basically is a target for us. The API community is target rich because they don't tend to be wedded to a party, and therefore we do concentrate on them. If you are, people will often say, well, they don't reach out to all of, use the example, API voters. If you are actually a voter, we will reach out to you and you vote. If you are not a voter, we are unlikely to spend a lot of money on you because it's really expensive to take someone and get them to be a voter and get them to the polls and get them to believe what you think you would like them to believe, as opposed to take somebody who's already going to the polling place or to their kitchen table, as the case might be, and getting them to vote. But you'll notice that the Republicans have sort of changed our ways a bit in Orange County in the sense that 2 of your sitting congresswomen are Asians. Michelle Steele and Young Kim, both Koreans. There's a booming Korean community there, and I think the Republican Party has gone to great lengths over the last several years to create a Republican Party that looks like America and not like my Thanksgiving dinner.
I would add too, one thing that's becoming fascinating, we didn't talk a lot about voter contact, which when we talk about money, what we're really talking about at the end of the day is how we're going to talk to voters, TV, direct mail, digital, all of those sorts of things. And what's fascinating when I communicate with the API community on a statewide level is we use API generally, and then it's not monolithic. We have Hmong, we have Korean, we have people who speak Cantonese, we have people who speak Mandarin. And so finding targeted and efficient ways to talk to them in language, it's a little easier on the Latin side. We can use Spanish. There are a few variations we use in statewide, but the API community, there's a lot of different dialects. They have different institutions they trust than traditional voters, and there are a lot of different publications. It's very segmented, and so I think one of the great pieces of progress we've made, because by the way, it's one of the fastest growing blocks of voters in the state, is finding new ways to communicate to them in language, which I think adds credibility and adds trust. And we had to do this a lot on the rent control issue and a couple others, but that's a fascinating voter block to talk to.
I'm going to recommend 2 books. One is by a staffer here, his name is Bill Wong. He wrote specifically about the API electorate in California, how it's overlooked, where resources should be spent. Another guy, Mike Madrid, is coming out with a book on the Latino electorate, almost on the same track, but more on a national scale. I would highly recommend you getting both those books and reading them. Secondly, the thinking among Democrats for way too long has been, well, we're not going to spend a lot of money on API outreach, Black outreach, and Hispanic, because they don't vote. They don't vote like white people vote. And that is a huge mistake, and it's coming back like Democrats in the blood. And you're starting to see it nationally now. Democrats are trying to figure this out. Why are we losing Latinos? And it's like, because you didn't spend the money making the outreach you need to do. And that's a big trend nationally and also here in California.
If they're not giving you what you want, we're happy to.
Okay, next question. We have less than 5 minutes, so I'm sorry, but we gotta make it really quick, and we'll try and get you quick responses so we get everybody here.
Hi, I'm Susie Edelman, and I'm from Princeton College. And I am majoring in communication studies, and I have a keen interest in politics. So my question is to Laura, and I think it's amazing to see such a young woman here on the panel. What is a piece of advice you can give to someone that is in communications but also has a keen interest in politics? What is an advice that you could give?
Do you want to do journalism, or do you think you want to do like communications on the politics side?
I don't know. I'm still figuring that out.
Okay, that's great. I think like the number one thing is learn how to write. Seems pretty like basic to people, but like I've seen some awfully written press releases. Also, it's good, I think bottom line, whether you're kind of on the government side / campaign side or the journalism side, like relationships are everything, and having good relationships with people is how you get scoops, and also how you get your boss or your campaign in the headlines. And so like I would say like write as much as you can, and also like try and meet with as many people as you can. Just like quantity over quality to get started is how you get to good places.
Okay, awesome. Thank
All right,
you.
thank you. Next question. Name name, school, 1 sentence question, please.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Aaron Prakash. I'm from St. Mary's College in California. Thanks for showing up today. My question is, we know that there's a conventional way of going about campaigning. So what advice would you give to a candidate who prefers a firebrand populist approach?
Any advice for?
Can we be a firebrand on the right, on the left? Yeah, right. So, I think that all of the Western world has seen an increase in populism. We'll call it that. We'll call it populism. I don't know how healthy that is. It can go down a lot of paths that aren't necessarily helpful, and that's populism on the left and populism on the right. I guess if you're asking what sort of campaign advice I would give them is, if you're going to be a populist, you're going to have to be one of those. You're going to have to be an exciting populist, and you're going to have to be a person that that concentrates on turning out people that are excited by your message. Which means you're going to probably say things that are outside the mainstream of political opinions. And I think you see that quite a bit when it comes to populist candidates. I mean, I would call Donald Trump a populist, right? I mean, I don't think there's much of a discussion there. Certainly not a normal old Republican. And he says things that are extreme. And there's examples. I would call Bernie Sanders a populist on the left. And they say things, he says things that make me wake up at night sweating. They both do, actually. So I think you just have to be willing to be out of the mainstream, and you have to be willing to say things that maybe you think large groups of mainstream people will disagree with you with, including most of the intelligentsia and the insiders. They're not going to like what you're saying and what you're doing. On the positive side, I think sometimes you got to hit an egg to crack it, and ideas that come from outside the mainstream have a way of being absorbed. When the mainstream parties won't address them, tension builds up, tension builds up, tension builds up, and you need someone to go in there and just say, screw it, damn, and that's what's happening in not just here, but in Europe as well right now.
All right, next question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Quickly.
Hi, my name is Angel Aguilar. I'm from Fullerton College. My question involves big news corporation, big news media, and their role in radicalizing Americans from both sides. My question is, what do you guys believe, or do you guys believe they should have the right to radicalize us and divide us, or should there be some censorship?
I mean, absolutely they should have the right, because if you start dictating who can't, say certain things, then that's censorship, and that's not the First Amendment. I think that's this has become somewhat controversial, but if we start deciding whose opinions are valid and whose words are valid, then it's going to be a real problem. That being said, I think a lot of the problems with democracy, you can hang around the necks of cable news and these, industries that understand to get clicks and to get viewership, you have to say the most radical and insane things. I think it's up to viewers and consumers of news to recognize that and make the judicious choice not to engage with those really radical, really partisan news outlets. But I think carte blanche, you can't just start censoring people. Then whoever's in power in the next 10 years gets to decide who to censor it to. It's always going to be a problem if we allow for censoring. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, next question, sorry. Last question.
Okay, hi, my name is Ariana Paz with Fullerton College. So my question is about the Taxpayer Protection Act. So how do you, or what tactics do you employ to persuade people to vote essentially for more taxes, given that you mentioned people are not seeing those improvements in, bad roads or the lack of public education improvements? Thus, there is really a lack of trust between people and disconnect. And it's so easy for people to just repeal it, and we're stuck in that deficit or that loophole. So
yeah, I actually like you. It seems like you're going to vote for our side of the issue, which I'm on the side that thinks we probably have too much taxes in California. And it's clear. Yeah, so
that measure doesn't increase taxes.
That measure does not increase taxes.
It cuts taxes.
Yeah, it doesn't even cut taxes, although there are 6 of the 340 taxes that were passed last year. Yeah, what it does is It requires voter approval on all new taxes. So currently, not all taxes or fees, things that you pay fees on, require voter approval. So currently on a statewide tax measure, 2/3 of the Assembly, 2/3 of the Senate, signature of the governor, tax goes into effect. Under this measure, that tax would have to go to the statewide electorate on the next ballot and be approved by voters before you'd have to start paying the taxes. To your point about accountability, the next thing it does is it demands that the tax clearly states what the rate is, how much of a tax increase it is, what the use is, how long it is, and provides accountability for where that tax dollars are going to go. We believe, again, we don't have a tax issue, we have an accountability issue. 12 months ago, we had a record surplus. Now, every single day, his old employer is telling us that the deficit is getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. So something happened for $160 billion to go away, and we think this measure addresses that. So we actually think there's a very high appetite for voters to have more power over how and when their taxes are raised. And I think the folks that are in charge up in this building probably see that favorability with it as well and have taken some steps to have it removed from the ballot actually before November. So again, it's probably the fight I'm paying the most attention to.
So when you advertise, you have to disclose who's backing the measure.
That's correct.
Who's backing the measure?
The top funder right now is the California Business Roundtable.
Yeah, so it's businessmen who want to cut their taxes.
Yeah.
All of our taxes.
Yeah.
It's businessmen who want to cut their taxes.
Yeah.
All right, that's it. Thank you for a very excellent answer.